the Gene. I'm sure I will have trouble pronouncing the author's name. It is Siddhartha Mukherjee. Mukherjee? Previously, I read his book, The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer, which was fantastic. I highly recommend it. I did not read The Laws of Medicine, which apparently was an earlier book. But one of my fellow book group readers, with respect to a discussion we've had of Charles Murray and Bernstein's book, The Bell Curve, which we've been discussing as a book to read, pointed out that Mukherjee criticized The Bell Curve. Notice that's page 343. I'm going to underline a couple of sections here. He begins, as public flamethrowers go, Bernstein was an old hand. His 1985 book, Crime and Human Nature, had ignited its own firestorm of controversy by claiming that ingrained characteristics such as personality and temperament were linked to criminal behavior. I'm going to underline that. Well, as far as I know, that's a pretty accurate statement that that's what his book claims, but also that it seems pretty accurate that personality and temperament are linked to criminal behavior. So I'm not sure why being a public flamethrower is such a bad thing in this case. But I'll have to research that. But then he goes on to say, a decade later, The Bell Curve made an even more incendiary set of claims. Murray and Bernstein proposed that intelligence was also largely ingrained, that is, genetic, and that it was unequally segregated among races. Now, as far as I recall, in The Bell Curve, while races are used as a concept, they also point out that there are no real objects that are referred to by the word races, but we'll have to check on how that is handled. Whites and Asians possessed higher IQs on average, and Africans and African Americans possessed lower IQs. I'm assuming that he's continuing to describe the book. This difference in intellectual capacity, Murray and Bernstein claim, was largely responsible for the chronic underperformance of African Americans in social and economic spheres. African Americans were lagging behind in the United States not because of systematic flaws in our social contracts, but because of systematic flaws in their mental constructs. To understand the Bell Curve, we need to begin with the definition of intelligence. Predictably, go with that, circle that word, it's indicative of Mukherjee's interpretation. Murray and Bernstein chose a narrow definition of intelligence, one that brings us back to 19th century biometrics and eugenics. Actually, I recall the Bell Curve's rendition or history of IQ was fantastic. Galton and his disciples, we might recall, were obsessed with the measurement of intelligence between 1890 and 1910. Let's recall an earlier discussion in the book. Dozens of tests were devised in Europe and America that purported to measure intelligence in some biased and quantitative manner. In 1904, Charles Spearman, a British statistician, noticed an important feature of these tests. People who did well in one test generally tended to do well in another test. Spearman hypothesized that this positive correlation existed because all the tests were obliquely measuring some mysterious common factor. This common factor, Spearman proposed, was not knowledge itself, but the capacity to acquire and manipulate abstract knowledge. Spearman called it general intelligence. He labeled it G. By the early 20th century, G had caught the imagination of the public. First, it captivated early eugenicists. In 1916, the Stanford psychologist Louis Terman, an avid supporter of the American eugenics movement, created a standardized test to rapidly and quantitatively assess general intelligence, hoping to use the test to select more intelligent humans for eugenic breeding. Recognizing that this measurement varied with age during childhood development, Terman advocated a new metric to quantify age-specific intelligence. If the subject's mental age was the same as his or her physical age, their intelligence quotient, or IQ, was defined as exactly 100. If the subject lagged in mental age compared to physical age, the IQ was less than 100. If she was more mentally advanced, she was assigned an IQ above 100. The numerical measure of intelligence was also particularly suited to the demands of the First and Second World Wars, during which recruits had to be assigned to wartime tasks requiring diverse skills based on rapid quantitative assessments. When veterans returned to civilian life after the wars, they found their lives dominated by intelligence testing. By the early 1940s, such tests had become accepted as an inherent part of American culture. IQ tests were used to rank job applicants, place children in school, and recruit agents for the Secret Service. In the 1950s, Americans commonly listed their IQs on their resumes, submitted the results of a test for a job application, or even chose their spouses based on the test. IQ scores were pinned on the babies who were on display in Better Babies contests, although how IQ was measured in a 2-year-old remained mysterious. These rhetorical and historical shifts in the concept of intelligence are worth noting, for we will return to them in a few paragraphs. General intelligence originated as a statistical correlation between tests given under particular circumstances to particular individuals. It morphed into the notion of general intelligence because of a hypothesis concerning the nature of human knowledge acquisition, and it was codified into IQ to serve the particular exigencies of war. In a cultural sense, the definition of G was an exquisitely self-reinforcing phenomena. Those who possessed it, anointed as intelligent and given the arbitration of the quality, had every incentive in the world to propagate its definition. Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, once defined a meme as a cultural unit that spreads virally through societies by mutating, replicating, and being selected. We might imagine G as such, a self-propagating unit. We might even call it a selfish G. That's a pun, obviously, on Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. It takes counterculture to counter culture.